Welcome back, and tonight we step into one of the darkest and most misunderstood professions of the Middle Ages. As the sun slowly disappears behind the walls of a medieval town and the last market stalls begin to close, a solitary figure prepares for another day of work. He is not a knight, a merchant, or a lord. He is a man whose very presence causes people to look away. A man needed by society yet rejected by it. A man who carries out justice but receives little kindness in return. Tonight, we will explore the lonely life of a medieval executioner. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable position, dim the lights if you wish, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. Imagine the sound of distant church bells echoing across narrow cobblestone streets. Imagine the faint glow of torches flickering against wooden houses as the town slowly falls asleep. Somewhere on the edge of that town lives a man whose story few people ever cared to tell. The executioner occupied a strange place in medieval society. Everyone knew who he was, yet few wished to speak to him. His work was essential to maintaining law and order, but the very act of performing that duty made him an outcast. Many people believed that simply touching an executioner could bring bad luck. Others refused to sit beside him in taverns, attend church with him, or allow their children to play near his home. Yet, despite this isolation, the executioner continued his work. Without him, sentences handed down by judges could not be carried out. Criminals would not be punished. Public authority would appear weak. Kings, nobles, and city councils all depended upon men like him. He stood at the end of every trial, every accusation, and every verdict. But who was this man behind the hood? What kind of life did he live when the crowds disappeared and the public square fell silent? Was he truly as feared as the stories suggest? Did he choose this life, or was it forced upon him? These are the questions we will answer tonight. As we journey through medieval Europe, we will discover how executioners were trained, where they lived, how they raised families, and why so many people treated them as untouchables. We will witness public executions, explore the tools of their trade, and uncover the hidden duties they performed beyond carrying out death sentences. We will also learn about the mistakes that could ruin an executioner's reputation and the burdens that followed him throughout his life. Perhaps most surprisingly, we will find that many executioners were not cruel monsters at all. They were ordinary people trapped within an extraordinary profession. Some inherited the role from their fathers. Others accepted it because they had no better choice. Many spent their entire lives walking a lonely path between necessity and rejection. So as the wind blows softly through the medieval streets and the town settles into darkness, let us begin our story. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of one of history's most isolated figures. This is the story of the lonely life of a medieval executioner. Imagine being born into a family that your neighbors already feared. Long before you took your first steps, before you spoke your first words, many people in your town had already decided what they thought of you. Not because of anything you had done, but because of who your father was. In many medieval towns across Europe, executioners often passed their profession down to their children. The son of an executioner frequently became an executioner himself. For most children, a family profession could be a source of pride. A blacksmith's son learned to shape iron. A baker's son learned to make bread. A merchant's son learned the art of trade. But the son of an executioner inherited something very different. He inherited isolation. From an early age, many executioners' children discovered that they were not treated like other children. Some were avoided in the marketplace. Others found themselves excluded from games and gatherings. Parents warned their children to stay away from them. Rumors and superstitions surrounded executioner families wherever they went. The medieval world was deeply influenced by religion, tradition, and fear. Many ordinary people viewed executioners as necessary but somehow tainted by their work. Since they carried out punishments and dealt with death, some believed they carried an invisible stain upon them. As a result, executioners and their families often lived on the outskirts of towns. Their homes might stand near city walls or beyond them altogether. While other families gathered near churches and busy markets, executioners frequently lived in quieter and more isolated areas. For a young boy growing up in such a household, loneliness was often a familiar companion. Yet life within the executioner's home could be surprisingly normal. Families still shared meals together. Children still played games. Parents still worried about the future of their sons and daughters. Behind closed doors, executioners were often ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives despite extraordinary circumstances. As the boy grew older, he began to understand the reality of his family's position. His father possessed skills that few others had. He understood anatomy. He knew how to handle weapons. He knew how to carry out punishments ordered by courts and nobles. These skills were not easily learned, and because society often rejected executioners, few outsiders wished to join their ranks. This created a cycle that lasted for generations. Executioners trained their own children because few others were willing to learn the profession. By the time a boy reached his teenage years, he might already be assisting his father with various tasks. At first, these duties were small and harmless. He might care for equipment, clean tools, or help maintain the family property. Gradually, he would be introduced to the responsibilities that defined his family's livelihood. Not every child accepted this future willingly. Some dreamed of escaping and beginning a new life elsewhere. Some hoped to become craftsmen, soldiers, or merchants. Yet medieval society offered limited opportunities. Family professions were often difficult to escape, especially when social prejudice followed a person wherever they went. For many young men, becoming an executioner was less a choice and more a destiny. And so, step by step, they moved toward a profession that few admired and many feared. Without realizing it, the lonely road had already begun. As a young apprentice entered adulthood, his education became far more serious. Contrary to popular belief, medieval executioners could not simply swing a sword and hope for the best. Their work demanded precision, discipline, and experience. A poorly performed execution could lead to public outrage, unnecessary suffering, and humiliation for everyone involved. For this reason, training often began years before a young man carried out his first official execution. Under the guidance of his father or another experienced executioner, he learned how to maintain weapons. Swords had to remain sharp. Axes required careful balancing. Ropes needed proper preparation. Every tool served a specific purpose, and mistakes could have terrible consequences. The apprentice also learned about the legal system. He studied different punishments and the crimes associated with them. Medieval courts imposed a wide variety of sentences depending on local laws and customs. Understanding these procedures was an important part of the profession. As time passed, the young apprentice accompanied experienced executioners during public events. These occasions could attract hundreds or even thousands of spectators. Market squares filled with merchants, travelers, local residents, and curious children. For many people, public executions were both a legal punishment and a public spectacle. Standing before such crowds was intimidating. The apprentice observed carefully. He watched how his mentor remained calm despite the noise of the gathering. He noticed how every movement appeared deliberate and controlled. Confidence was essential because hesitation could quickly undermine authority. Eventually, the day arrived when the apprentice would face his greatest challenge. His first execution. The night before may have been sleepless. Fear, anxiety, and uncertainty likely filled his thoughts. No amount of training could fully prepare a person for the reality of carrying out a death sentence. As dawn approached, church bells echoed across the town. People gathered in the square. Vendors sold food. Conversations spread through the crowd. Some spectators came out of curiosity. Others arrived seeking justice. The atmosphere combined tension, anticipation, and unease. The young executioner stepped forward. Hundreds of eyes followed his movements. In that moment, he understood something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He stood completely alone. Although surrounded by people, he occupied a role that few could truly understand. Success meant performing his duty efficiently and professionally. Failure could damage his reputation for years. With careful preparation and steady hands, he carried out the task assigned to him. When it was over, the crowd slowly dispersed. Families returned home. Merchants reopened their stalls. The town resumed its normal rhythm. But for the young executioner, life would never be quite the same. He had crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer merely the son of an executioner. He had become one himself. And with that transformation came the burden, responsibility, and loneliness that accompanied the profession throughout the medieval world. By the time an executioner had mastered his profession, he had usually learned an uncomfortable truth. The greatest challenge of his life was not the work itself. It was the people around him. Although medieval society depended upon executioners, few people wished to associate with them. The same townsfolk who demanded justice often treated the man who carried it out as an outsider. This contradiction followed executioners throughout their lives. To understand why, we must first understand how medieval people viewed death. In the modern world, death is often hidden from public view. Hospitals, funeral homes, and cemeteries separate most people from the reality of mortality. In the Middle Ages, however, death was a constant presence. Disease, famine, war, and accidents were common. Most people expected to witness death many times throughout their lives. Yet despite this familiarity, death still inspired fear. Many people believed that those who regularly dealt with death became spiritually contaminated in some way. Since executioners carried out punishments and handled the bodies of the condemned, they were often viewed with suspicion. Some citizens crossed the street rather than walk beside an executioner. Others refused to shake his hand. Certain shopkeepers were reluctant to serve him. Even when an executioner entered a tavern after a long day of work, he might find empty seats around him as other customers quietly moved away. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same people who avoided him often attended public executions. They gathered in large crowds to witness punishments. They cheered when justice was served. They demanded order and security within their communities. Yet when the execution ended, they wanted nothing to do with the man responsible. For executioners, loneliness became a permanent part of life. Some learned to accept it. Others struggled with bitterness and frustration. Imagine spending years serving your community while knowing that many of your neighbors secretly despised you. Imagine knowing that no matter how honestly you worked, your reputation would never fully recover. For many executioners, this was everyday reality. Over time, entire executioner families developed close bonds with one another because society offered them few alternatives. Friendships outside their profession could be difficult to maintain. Marriage opportunities were often limited. Social gatherings frequently excluded them. As a result, executioners formed their own small worlds on the edges of medieval society. There, among family members and a handful of trusted companions, they found the acceptance that the wider community denied them. Yet no matter how strong these private relationships became, the message from society remained clear. The executioner was needed, but he would never truly belong. For most people in medieval Europe, community was everything. A person's identity came from family, neighbors, guilds, churches, and local traditions. Daily life revolved around social connections. People worked together, celebrated together, and survived hardships together. An executioner lived differently. While he technically belonged to the town, he often existed outside its social fabric. Many executioners were forced to build their homes on the outskirts of settlements. Their houses frequently stood near city walls, rivers, or isolated roads. The physical distance reflected the emotional distance that separated them from the rest of society. When church services were held, some executioners found themselves sitting apart from others. When festivals filled the streets with music and celebration, they were sometimes unwelcome guests. Even children could inherit this social burden. The son or daughter of an executioner often carried the same stigma. Classmates avoided them. Parents warned their children not to become too friendly with them. In some towns, entire families lived under a shadow they had done nothing to create. Marriage presented another challenge. Finding a spouse was difficult for someone associated with such a feared profession. Many respectable families refused to allow their daughters to marry executioners. As a result, executioners often married within a small circle of similar professions or executioner families from neighboring regions. This created generations of families tied together by necessity rather than choice. Yet despite these hardships, executioners still found ways to live meaningful lives. They raised children. They celebrated holidays. They repaired their homes, cared for animals, and worried about the future just like everyone else. Behind the frightening reputation was a human being trying to navigate a difficult existence. Some executioners became surprisingly respected for qualities unrelated to their profession. Because they possessed knowledge of anatomy and injuries, they occasionally assisted with medical treatments. Others developed reputations for fairness, discipline, or reliability. But even the most respected executioner rarely escaped the shadow of his occupation. No matter how kind he was, no matter how honest he was, no matter how faithfully he served his community, the title of executioner followed him everywhere. And so each evening, after the market closed and the streets grew quiet, he returned home carrying a burden invisible to everyone else. The burden of being known by all, yet accepted by very few. Despite what many people imagined, executioners did not spend their entire lives alone. Most had families. They married, raised children, worried about household expenses, and experienced many of the same joys and hardships as their neighbors. Yet the shadow of their profession stretched across every aspect of family life. For an executioner's wife, marriage often meant accepting a difficult social position. Even if she came from a respectable family, many townspeople would judge her for marrying the man responsible for carrying out punishments. Invitations became rare. Friendships could disappear. Some neighbors treated her with suspicion despite having done nothing wrong. Yet many wives stood beside their husbands through years of isolation. Life inside an executioner's household was often quieter than outsiders imagined. The family shared meals together, cared for animals, repaired clothing, and prepared for harsh winters just like everyone else. The greatest challenge often involved the children. A child cannot choose his father's profession. Yet in medieval society, children frequently inherited both occupations and reputations. Boys and girls from executioner families sometimes found themselves excluded from games and gatherings. Other parents warned their children to keep their distance. Rumors spread easily, and superstitions often survived longer than facts. Some children grew up angry. Others became resigned to their circumstances. Many learned very early that the world viewed them differently. As a result, executioner families often developed strong bonds with one another. Since acceptance was difficult to find elsewhere, family became their safest refuge. Within the walls of their home, they could simply be themselves. A father, a mother, a son, a daughter. Not an executioner and his family. Just people trying to live ordinary lives in an extraordinary situation. But as the children grew older, an uncomfortable question inevitably appeared. Would the next generation follow the same path? For many families, the answer was yes. And with that answer came a future few truly desired. Imagine knowing the course of your life before reaching adulthood. For many executioners' children, this was a very real possibility. In medieval Europe, professions often passed from one generation to the next. Blacksmiths trained their sons. Bakers taught their children the family trade. Executioners were no different. The difference was that few people wanted to become executioners. Because society treated executioner families as outsiders, opportunities were limited. A young man hoping to become a merchant or craftsman often faced rejection. Guilds could refuse membership. Employers could turn him away. His father's reputation followed him everywhere. As a result, many sons eventually entered the same profession. Training usually began gradually. At first, the young apprentice performed simple tasks. He cleaned equipment, cared for animals, and assisted with household responsibilities. Later, he learned how to maintain swords, sharpen blades, and understand legal procedures. Some accepted this future without resistance. Others dreamed of escape. Stories occasionally tell of young men leaving their towns in hopes of starting over elsewhere. A few succeeded. Most did not. The medieval world was smaller than it appeared. News traveled. Reputations traveled. Family names traveled. Escaping one's identity was far more difficult than simply walking away. For daughters, life presented different challenges. Marriage opportunities could be limited because many families wished to avoid association with executioners. Some women married into other executioner families, creating networks that stretched across regions and even countries. Over generations, these family connections became remarkably strong. Executioners often understood one another in ways that ordinary townspeople could not. They shared similar experiences, the same loneliness, the same social barriers, the same burden of being necessary but unwelcome. Yet amid these hardships, many families survived and even prospered. They found happiness where they could. They celebrated births, weddings, and holidays. They laughed, argued, and dreamed about the future. History often remembers executioners only for their profession. But behind every executioner stood a family that carried the weight of society's judgment together. And for many children born into these households, that burden would shape the course of their entire lives. As dawn broke over the rooftops of a medieval town, most people awoke thinking about the ordinary tasks ahead of them. Merchants prepared their stalls. Farmers gathered their tools. Blacksmiths lit their furnaces. But for the executioner, every morning began with a different awareness. At any moment, a messenger might arrive at his door. A judge could issue a sentence. A city council could demand his services. An execution might be scheduled for that very day. Unlike many professions, the executioner's work was unpredictable. Some weeks passed quietly with little official business. Other times, several punishments might be ordered within a short period. Because of this uncertainty, executioners needed to remain prepared at all times. A typical morning often began with equipment maintenance. Swords were inspected carefully. Axes were sharpened. Ropes were examined for signs of wear. A poorly maintained tool could create disaster during a public punishment. Not only would this cause unnecessary suffering, but it could also damage the executioner's reputation. For that reason, preparation was considered essential. As sunlight filled the streets, the executioner might also review official documents delivered by local authorities. Medieval legal systems varied greatly from one region to another, and understanding the exact sentence was an important responsibility. Every punishment carried specific requirements. Mistakes could create legal and political problems. After completing these duties, the executioner often turned his attention to household matters. Contrary to popular imagination, he spent much of his time doing ordinary tasks: feeding animals, repairing fences, collecting firewood, maintaining his property. Many executioners owned small plots of land and participated in everyday activities similar to those of their neighbors. Yet even during these peaceful moments, a sense of separation remained. People passing by might avoid eye contact. Children could stare from a distance. Conversations sometimes stopped when he approached. The executioner rarely forgot his place within society. Even on the quietest mornings, the invisible wall between him and everyone else remained firmly in place. And so the day continued, part craftsman, part public servant, part outcast, always waiting for the next knock at the door. When most people imagine an executioner, they picture a man standing on a scaffold before a large crowd. But that image represents only a small fraction of his life. The truth is that many executioners spent far more time away from executions than participating in them. In some towns, weeks or even months could pass without a major punishment taking place. During these periods, executioners often performed a variety of other duties. Some acted as animal catchers, removing stray or dangerous animals from city streets. Others disposed of animal carcasses. Certain executioners were responsible for maintaining public order in ways that had little connection to executions. These tasks were unpleasant, but they provided additional income and ensured that the executioner remained useful to local authorities. Because they handled injuries, death, and the human body more frequently than most people, some executioners even developed a surprising knowledge of anatomy. In a few regions, they gained reputations as healers. This may sound strange today, but medieval medicine was very different from modern healthcare. People often sought help from anyone believed to possess useful knowledge. An executioner who understood bones, muscles, and wounds could sometimes offer treatments unavailable elsewhere. Despite these occasional successes, public attitudes rarely changed. A man might accept medical assistance from an executioner in private, yet later refused to sit beside him at a public gathering. This contradiction defined much of the executioner's existence. He was useful, sometimes even respected, but never fully accepted. As evening approached, the town gradually settled into silence. Market stalls closed. Church bells rang. Families gathered for supper. The executioner returned home much like everyone else. But while most citizens ended their day surrounded by community, he often ended his day on its edge. A familiar figure, a necessary figure, and yet, in many ways, still a stranger among his own people. For most people in medieval Europe, the executioner's tools were objects of fear. They were rarely seen up close. Most citizens encountered them only during public punishments, often from the safety of a crowd. To them, these instruments represented judgment, authority, and death. But to the executioner, they were simply tools of a profession. Just as a blacksmith relied on his hammer or a carpenter depended on his saw, the executioner depended on his equipment. The difference was that mistakes carried far greater consequences. Among the most famous tools was the executioner's sword. Unlike ordinary battlefield swords, executioner's swords were often designed specifically for carrying out sentences. Many lacked sharp points because they were never intended for combat. Their purpose was singular and grim. These weapons were usually broader and heavier than standard swords. A clean execution required tremendous precision, and the sword's design helped deliver a powerful strike. Maintaining such a weapon demanded constant attention. The blade had to remain perfectly sharp. Rust had to be removed. The balance had to be preserved. A neglected sword could transform a swift execution into a horrifying spectacle. Axes were equally common throughout many regions of Europe. Unlike swords, axes varied significantly in shape and size. Some were crafted specifically for executions, while others resembled ordinary woodcutting tools adapted for the task. The executioner often developed strong preferences regarding his equipment. A trusted axe might serve him for years. Some executioners cared for their tools with extraordinary dedication. They cleaned them meticulously, stored them carefully, and protected them from damage. To outsiders, this attention might seem strange, but professional pride existed even within such a feared occupation. The executioner understood that his responsibility extended beyond carrying out sentences. He was expected to perform his duties efficiently and competently. Poor craftsmanship reflected badly upon both the individual and the authorities he served. Beyond swords and axes, ropes played an important role. Preparing a rope was more complicated than many modern people realize. Its length, strength, and condition required careful inspection. An improperly prepared rope could fail during an execution, creating chaos and humiliation. The executioner learned through experience which materials worked best and how to avoid dangerous mistakes. Many tools associated with punishment have not survived the centuries. Wood rotted, metal rusted, records disappeared. Yet historical accounts reveal a profession that depended heavily upon preparation and expertise. The image of the executioner as a reckless brute fails to match reality. In truth, many approached their work with the precision of skilled craftsmen. Their tools were not symbols of personal cruelty. They were instruments of a legal system that demanded results. and every tool carried a burden far heavier than its physical weight. For whenever the executioner lifted a sword or grasped an axe, he understood exactly why it had been placed in his hands. The crowd often noticed only the final moment. The raised sword, the silent pause, the single decisive action. What they rarely considered was the burden carried by the person holding the blade. Every execution placed enormous pressure upon the executioner. Unlike soldiers fighting in battle, executioners worked alone and under direct public scrutiny. Hundreds of eyes watched every movement, every hesitation, every mistake. Success brought little praise. Failure brought lasting shame. This reality created tremendous psychological pressure. An executioner could spend days preparing for a major event. He reviewed procedures, inspected equipment, practiced movements, considered every possible complication. Even then, uncertainty remained. Weather conditions could affect visibility. Crowds could become restless. The condemned person might panic. Any unexpected development could transform an orderly punishment into confusion. As a result, experienced executioners developed rituals and routines. Some preferred to inspect their equipment multiple times before an execution. Others spent quiet moments alone gathering their thoughts. Many relied on habits built through years of experience. These routines provided stability in an unpredictable profession. Historical accounts occasionally describe executioners practicing strikes on wooden blocks, animal carcasses, or other training materials. Accuracy mattered. A single clean motion was considered the mark of a skilled professional. The public expected competence. Authorities expected competence. The condemned person often hoped for competence as well. In a strange and uncomfortable way, everyone involved wanted the same thing: for the punishment to be completed swiftly. This expectation followed executioners throughout their careers. A successful execution might be forgotten within days. A failed one could be remembered for decades. Stories of botched executions spread rapidly through medieval towns. Witnesses repeated details. Rumors grew. Reputations suffered. For executioners, these stories represented more than embarrassment. They threatened livelihoods. Trust was difficult to earn and easy to lose. And so, before every public punishment, the executioner faced a familiar burden. Not merely the weight of steel, not merely the weight of law, but the weight of expectation. As he stood before the crowd, gripping the handle of a carefully maintained sword, he carried the hopes of judges, the demands of authorities, the curiosity of spectators, and the fate of the condemned. The blade itself may have weighed only a few pounds, yet the responsibility attached to it was immeasurably heavier. And with each passing year, that invisible weight became one of the defining features of a medieval executioner's life. Long before the crowd gathered and long before the condemned prisoner was led into the square, the executioner's work had already begun. The day of an execution often started earlier than usual. The town itself seemed different. People whispered in the streets. Merchants discussed rumors while setting up their stalls. Children talked excitedly about what they expected to see. Even those who claimed they would not attend often found themselves drawn toward the square as the hour approached. For the executioner, however, this was not entertainment. It was a day of responsibility. Before sunrise, he carefully inspected every piece of equipment that would be used. A dull blade could create disaster. A damaged rope could fail. Every detail mattered. Many executioners developed strict routines. Some sharpened their swords one final time. Others checked their tools repeatedly, even when they already knew everything was in perfect condition. These habits were not signs of fear. They were signs of experience. The executioner understood that a single mistake could remain attached to his name for years. After preparing his equipment, he often met with local officials. Sentences had to be confirmed. Procedures had to be reviewed. Authorities wanted to ensure that everything followed the law. Although the executioner carried out the punishment, he did not decide who would be punished. That decision belonged to judges, magistrates, and rulers. His role was to enforce their verdict. As the morning progressed, crowds slowly began filling the town square. Some people arrived out of curiosity. Others came seeking justice. A few attended because public executions were rare events that disrupted ordinary life. The executioner usually avoided the growing crowd until the final moments. He understood that many spectators viewed him with fear or hostility. Some stared, some whispered, some made the sign of the cross as he passed. Others looked away entirely. By midday, the atmosphere could become strangely tense. Excitement mixed with anxiety. Anticipation mixed with dread. Everyone knew what was coming. Yet few people truly understood the burden carried by the man responsible for carrying it out. As the hour approached, the executioner often found himself alone with his thoughts. He knew that within minutes, hundreds of eyes would be watching him. His reputation, his skill, his professionalism, everything would be judged. And so, with quiet determination, he prepared himself for another day that would be remembered by everyone except the person most responsible for it. Because while the crowd remembered the spectacle, the executioner remembered the responsibility. While the executioner prepared his tools, another person faced a very different morning. The condemned prisoner. For this individual, the day would be their last. Throughout medieval Europe, final hours varied depending on local customs and the nature of the crime. Some prisoners spent their final night in prayer. Others met with priests, family members, or local officials. Many simply waited. Waiting was perhaps the most difficult part. The hours moved slowly. Every church bell became a reminder. Every footstep outside the cell carried meaning. Every sound seemed louder than usual. The executioner occasionally interacted with condemned prisoners before an execution. Contrary to popular myths, these encounters were not always hostile. Professional executioners understood that panic made their jobs more difficult. A calm prisoner reduced the risk of complications. As a result, some executioners developed surprisingly respectful relationships with those they were ordered to punish. Historical records occasionally describe conversations between executioners and prisoners during the final hours. Some spoke about faith. Some discussed family. Some remained silent. Others asked questions about what would happen next. The answers varied, but one reality remained constant. Both men understood what the day would bring. As the appointed time approached, guards escorted the prisoner from the cell. Outside, the sounds of the crowd grew louder. The square awaited. For many prisoners, this walk became the longest journey of their lives. Every step carried them closer to an unavoidable destination. Some walked bravely. Others trembled. Many prayed. A few attempted to address the crowd. Meanwhile, the executioner waited. He stood where he had stood countless times before, prepared, focused, silent. In many ways, he was the final person the condemned would see clearly. A strange connection existed between them. One represented society's judgment, the other its punishment. Neither had chosen the circumstances of that day, yet both were bound together by the machinery of medieval justice. As the prisoner approached the scaffold, the crowd fell quieter. The moment everyone had anticipated was finally arriving. And for the executioner, another chapter of his difficult profession was about to begin. By the time the executioner stepped into the town square, the crowd had often been gathering for hours. People arrived from nearby villages. Travelers delayed their journeys. Merchants paused their business. Even individuals who claimed to dislike such spectacles frequently found themselves standing among the spectators. Public executions were among the most unusual events in medieval life. For modern people, this can be difficult to understand. Today, punishment is largely hidden from public view. Courtrooms, prisons, and legal procedures take place behind walls and closed doors. Medieval society operated very differently. Justice was meant to be seen. Authorities believed that public punishment discouraged crime. If ordinary people witnessed the consequences of theft, murder, or rebellion, they might think twice before committing similar acts. At least that was the theory. In reality, executions often attracted people for many different reasons. Some came seeking justice. Others came out of curiosity. Some attended because everyone else was attending. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Vendors sold food and drink. Conversations echoed throughout the square. In certain towns, an execution could feel strangely similar to a public festival. This atmosphere created a deeply uncomfortable contrast. At the center of the gathering stood a person facing death. Around them stood hundreds of spectators treating the event as entertainment. The executioner understood this contradiction better than anyone. Unlike the crowd, he could not afford excitement. His role demanded concentration. A restless audience could become dangerous. A panicked prisoner could complicate the procedure. Every movement required attention. As he approached the scaffold, many eyes focused upon him. Some spectators stared openly. Others whispered to their neighbors. A few crossed themselves in prayer. The executioner's reputation often arrived before he did. Many people already knew his name. They knew where he lived. They knew stories about previous executions. Some stories were true. Many were exaggerated. All of them contributed to the mysterious image surrounding his profession. Standing before such a crowd required unusual confidence. Imagine hundreds of strangers silently judging every action you take. Imagine knowing that a single mistake could become the subject of gossip for years. This pressure accompanied every public execution. The crowd expected perfection. The authorities expected obedience. The condemned hoped for mercy, or at least competence. And the executioner stood between all of these expectations. For a few brief moments, he became the most visible person in the entire town. Yet despite being seen by everyone, he remained understood by almost no one. As the condemned prisoner reached the scaffold, an unusual silence often settled over the crowd. The conversations faded. The laughter disappeared. Even the most curious spectators became quiet. Everyone understood that the moment they had come to witness was finally near. For the executioner, this was the point where preparation ended and responsibility began. The hours spent inspecting equipment, the conversations with officials, the careful planning, all of it led to this single moment. Historical records suggest that experienced executioners developed remarkable self-control. They had to. Fear could not be allowed to influence their movements. Anger could not be allowed to influence their decisions. Emotion had to be pushed aside in favor of precision. Many prisoners reacted differently in their final moments. Some prayed. Some cried. Some remained silent. A few attempted to address the crowd. Others seemed completely overwhelmed by fear. The executioner had witnessed all of these reactions before. Yet familiarity did not necessarily make the experience easier. Every person who stood before him had their own story, their own family, their own regrets, their own hopes that had somehow led them to this final destination. The crowd rarely considered such things. Most spectators saw only the crime, the punishment, the outcome. The executioner stood close enough to see the human being. This perspective sometimes created a complicated emotional burden. He was expected to remain detached, professional, efficient, yet he could not completely ignore the reality unfolding before him. As the final moments approached, the square often became so quiet that individual sounds could be heard clearly. The movement of clothing, the creaking of wooden boards, the distant cry of a bird overhead, the wind moving through nearby buildings. Time itself seemed to slow. Then came the decisive moment, the moment that would later be described in taverns, homes, and marketplaces throughout the region. The crowd witnessed only a few seconds. For the executioner, those seconds carried the weight of years. Everything depended upon them. A clean execution reinforced his reputation. A mistake could haunt him for the rest of his career. When the punishment ended, the silence usually lasted only briefly. Soon the crowd began moving again. People resumed conversations. Merchants returned to business. Children followed their parents home. Life continued. But for the executioner, another memory had been added to a collection that few people could imagine. A collection of faces, names, voices, final moments. The crowd would remember the event for a few days, perhaps a few weeks. The executioner might remember it for the rest of his life. And as the square slowly emptied beneath the fading afternoon sun, he once again found himself carrying a burden invisible to everyone around him. The burden of being the man who stood at the very end of another person's story. When most people thought of an executioner, they imagined a man standing on a scaffold, holding a sword before a silent crowd. But the truth was far more complicated. In many medieval towns, executions represented only a small portion of an executioner's work. The rest of the time, he performed duties that most citizens preferred not to think about. These tasks were unpleasant, sometimes disturbing, often necessary, and almost always hidden from public attention. The medieval world lacked many of the services modern people take for granted. There were no organized sanitation departments, no professional animal control services, no emergency cleanup crews. When society encountered jobs that nobody wanted to perform, those responsibilities frequently fell upon the executioner. One common duty involved removing dead animals from roads and public spaces. A horse that collapsed in the street. A cow that died unexpectedly. A stray dog found near the market. Someone needed to dispose of these carcasses before disease spread. Very few people volunteered. The executioner usually received the task. Because of this work, many executioners possessed carts specifically designed to transport animal remains beyond town limits. The smell alone made the task unpleasant, yet it remained essential for public health. In some regions, Executioners were also responsible for maintaining torture equipment used during criminal investigations. This responsibility carried its own emotional burden. Even when they were not directly involved in questioning prisoners, executioners often maintained the devices authorities relied upon. The average citizen rarely saw these preparations. They saw only the final punishment, never the countless duties hidden behind the scenes. Another surprising responsibility involved dealing with individuals considered dangerous or undesirable by local authorities. Certain towns tasked executioners with capturing violent animals. Others required them to supervise public punishments that stopped short of execution. Whippings, brandings, public humiliations. Each punishment required organization and oversight. The executioner became a specialist in society's most uncomfortable responsibilities. People depended on him whenever a task seemed too unpleasant, too frightening, or too controversial for ordinary citizens. This arrangement created a strange contradiction. The community needed him constantly, yet the community rarely respected him. The more difficult his duties became, the more isolated he often felt. It was as though society wished to benefit from his work while pretending he did not exist. Over time, many executioners accepted this reality. They learned not to expect gratitude. They learned not to expect friendship. Instead, they focused on completing their responsibilities as efficiently as possible, day after day, year after year, performing tasks that kept medieval towns functioning, even as the towns themselves kept their distance. And so the executioner's life became larger than the scaffold, far larger. He was not merely the man who carried out death sentences. He was the man society called whenever no one else would answer. Among the strangest chapters in the history of medieval executioners is a fact that many modern people find difficult to believe. Some executioners became healers. At first glance, this seems impossible. How could a man associated with death also become someone people sought for medical help? The answer lies in the unique knowledge executioners possessed. Unlike most citizens, executioners spent years studying the human body. Their profession required understanding muscles, joints, bones, and anatomy. They observed injuries. They witnessed wounds. They saw firsthand how the body reacted to trauma. While medieval universities taught medicine to a small number of educated physicians, executioners gained practical knowledge through experience. And in a world where reliable medical care was often scarce, practical knowledge carried tremendous value. Historical records from parts of Germany, France, and Central Europe reveal that some executioners treated broken bones, dislocated joints, and other injuries. People who publicly avoided them sometimes visited them in secret. Imagine the irony. A merchant might refuse to sit beside an executioner at a public feast, yet later visit his home seeking treatment for an injured arm. A nobleman might criticize executioners openly, yet quietly request their assistance after an accident. The contradiction was remarkable. The same society that feared executioners often depended upon them in unexpected ways. Some executioners became quite skilled. Word of their abilities spread beyond local communities. Travelers arrived seeking help. Patients recommended them to friends. Their reputations as healers occasionally rivaled their reputations as executioners. Yet acceptance remained frustratingly limited. No matter how many people they helped, no matter how many injuries they treated, no matter how much suffering they relieved, the stigma of their profession rarely disappeared. Many citizens continued viewing them through the lens of fear and superstition. For executioners, this reality could be deeply frustrating. They possessed valuable skills. They served their communities. They saved lives as well as ended them. And still they remained outsiders. As evening settled over medieval towns, executioners often returned home carrying two very different identities. To some people, they were instruments of justice. To others, they were sources of healing. Yet neither role granted them full acceptance. Perhaps this is what made their lives so unusual. They stood between worlds, between life and death, between fear and respect, between necessity and rejection. And nowhere was that contradiction more visible than in the strange reality of an executioner who spent one day ending a life and the next helping to save another. For a profession remembered almost entirely for death, it is a reminder that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. For a medieval executioner, there was one thing more frightening than an angry criminal. An angry crowd. Most executions lasted only a few moments. The condemned prisoner was brought before the public, the sentence was carried out, and the town returned to its daily routine. But not every execution went according to plan. Sometimes, despite years of training and preparation, things went terribly wrong. And when they did, the consequences could follow an executioner for the rest of his life. The greatest fear of any professional executioner was failure. A clean execution demonstrated skill and competence. A failed execution suggested carelessness, weakness, or inexperience. In a profession built entirely upon reputation, such mistakes could be devastating. One common problem involved equipment. A sword might strike poorly. An axe could become damaged. A rope could fail unexpectedly. Even the best prepared executioners could encounter circumstances beyond their control. Weather often created difficulties. Rain made wooden scaffolds slippery. Strong winds interfered with visibility. Cold temperatures affected both equipment and concentration. Unlike modern professions, medieval executioners worked without advanced technology or safety measures. Every execution contained an element of uncertainty. The crowd rarely cared about these challenges. Spectators expected perfection. They expected justice to be swift and decisive. When reality failed to match those expectations, frustration quickly spread. Historical records contain numerous accounts of crowds becoming restless during unsuccessful executions. Whispers moved through the audience. People questioned the executioner's abilities. Some shouted insults. Others accused him of incompetence. The atmosphere could change within minutes. What began as a public punishment sometimes transformed into public criticism of the executioner himself. This pressure was particularly intense for younger executioners. Veterans possessed experience and established reputations. A newcomer enjoyed no such protection. One highly visible mistake could damage years of effort. Stories traveled rapidly through medieval communities. A failed execution in one town might become known in neighboring regions within days. Travelers carried news. Merchants repeated rumors. Witnesses shared dramatic versions of events. With every retelling, details often became exaggerated. A small mistake became a major disaster. A difficult execution became a legendary failure. The executioner had little control over these stories. Once they entered public conversation, they developed lives of their own. And so, every time an executioner climbed the scaffold, he carried more than his tools. He carried the weight of expectation, the weight of reputation, and the knowledge that a single bad day might define his entire career. When an execution ended badly, the consequences did not disappear with the crowd. In many ways, that was when the real trouble began. As spectators returned home, conversations immediately started. Families discussed what they had witnessed. Merchants shared opinions with customers. Taverns filled with stories and criticism. The executioner's performance became the subject of public debate. Unlike modern workers, executioners could not easily move on from mistakes. Their profession was highly visible. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone knew where they lived. And everyone had an opinion. A failed execution could damage public confidence for years. Some authorities responded harshly. City councils expected competence. Judges expected professionalism. If an execution created controversy, officials sometimes blamed the executioner rather than the circumstances surrounding the event. In certain cases, fines were imposed. Contracts were reconsidered. Employment became uncertain. The pressure could be enormous. Imagine knowing that hundreds of people had witnessed your worst professional moment. Imagine hearing strangers discuss it every day. Imagine realizing that your mistake had become a story that might survive for decades. This was the reality many executioners faced. Perhaps the most difficult burden was psychological. Executioners were human beings. Despite their training, they experienced embarrassment, anxiety, and regret like anyone else. A poor execution could haunt them long after the event itself. Some reportedly replayed mistakes in their minds for years, wondering what they could have done differently, wondering how events might have changed, wondering whether their reputation would ever recover. Yet many executioners continued working despite these setbacks. They had little choice. Their families depended upon them. Their communities still required their services. And life in the Middle Ages offered few opportunities for starting over. Over time, some rebuilt their reputations through consistent work. Others never fully escaped the shadow of a single failure. The crowd remembered. The stories remained. The rumors survived. And so the executioner learned one of the harshest lessons of his profession. Success was expected. Failure was unforgettable. As years passed and new executions replaced old ones, memories gradually faded. But not entirely. Somewhere in the town, someone always remembered. Someone always told the story. Someone always recalled the day when everything went wrong. And for the executioner, that memory could become a lifelong companion, an invisible burden carried long after the scaffold had been dismantled and the crowd had gone home. Most executioners lived and died in relative obscurity. Their names disappeared into history. Their stories faded. Their graves were forgotten. Yet a small number became famous, sometimes respected, sometimes feared, and occasionally remembered long after kings and nobles had been forgotten. One of the most remarkable examples was a German executioner named Franz Schmidt. Born in the 16th century, Schmidt would eventually become one of the most well-documented executioners in European history. Unlike many of his predecessors, he kept detailed records of his life. These records survive to this day, offering historians a rare glimpse into a profession usually hidden behind silence. Franz Schmidt did not choose his profession willingly. His father had been forced into the role after a political dispute, and the family's future changed forever. As a result, Schmidt inherited a life he never truly desired. Yet once he entered the profession, he approached it with extraordinary professionalism. Over the course of his career, he carried out hundreds of executions and punishments. But that is not what made him famous. What made him remarkable was his concern for precision and fairness. Historical records suggest that he took pride in performing executions cleanly and efficiently. He viewed unnecessary suffering as a failure of professional responsibility. This attitude earned him respect even among people who feared his profession. Perhaps even more surprising, Schmidt also became known as a healer. He treated injuries, set broken bones, provided medical advice. Over time, he reportedly helped thousands of patients. His reputation as a healer eventually became so strong that many people sought his assistance despite the stigma attached to his occupation. After decades of service, he successfully petitioned authorities to restore honor to his family name. For an executioner, this achievement was extraordinary. Few ever escaped the social burden attached to the profession. Franz Schmidt became one of the rare exceptions. His story reveals something important. Executioners were not always the cruel figures portrayed in popular imagination. Some were thoughtful, disciplined, and deeply aware of the responsibilities they carried. Yet Schmidt's story was unusual. Most executioners faced far less favorable circumstances. Many struggled against public hatred for their entire lives. Others became known only through rumors and frightening legends. And those legends often grew larger with every passing year. The medieval world loved stories. In taverns illuminated by candlelight, travelers exchanged rumors from distant towns. Farmers shared local legends. Merchants repeated dramatic tales gathered during long journeys. Executioners frequently appeared in these stories. Unfortunately for them, the stories were rarely flattering. Because executioners lived on the margins of society, many people knew very little about their actual lives. Where knowledge ended, imagination began. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed executioners possessed secret knowledge. Others insisted they practiced strange rituals. Certain communities believed executioners carried curses or supernatural abilities. Children frightened one another with stories involving mysterious men who lived beyond the town walls. The truth was usually far less dramatic. Most executioners spent their days maintaining equipment, performing civic duties, and supporting their families. Yet ordinary reality rarely competes with a good story. As years passed, legends became increasingly exaggerated. A skilled executioner who performed his duties efficiently might be transformed into a terrifying giant in local folklore. An isolated family could become the subject of ghost stories. Even harmless habits sometimes acquired sinister explanations. People fear what they do not understand, and few medieval professions were less understood than that of the executioner. In some regions, executioners gained reputations that bordered on celebrity. Travelers recognized their names. Authorities requested their services from distant towns. Crowds discussed their previous work before major executions. This strange form of fame brought little comfort. Recognition did not equal acceptance. An executioner might be widely known while remaining socially isolated. He might become famous without becoming respected. This contradiction defined much of the profession. The public wanted stories. The public wanted legends. The public wanted villains. Real human beings were far more complicated. Behind every frightening tale stood an individual with ordinary concerns. Someone who worried about family. Someone who worried about money. Someone who hoped for a better future. Yet history often remembers the legend instead. As a result, many executioners became trapped between reality and myth. The man disappeared. The story remained. Even today, when people imagine medieval executioners, they often picture figures drawn from folklore rather than history. Dark silhouettes, emotionless faces, mysterious strangers lurking at the edge of society. The truth is both simpler and sadder. Most executioners were not monsters. They were ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens. And perhaps that is what makes their stories so fascinating centuries later. Not because they were different from everyone else, but because, despite everything, they were so very human. As the evening grows darker and the medieval town settles into silence, we leave behind the legends and return to reality. For our executioner is growing older now. The years have passed. The crowds have come and gone. And a new chapter of his life is about to begin. Time spares no one. Not kings, not soldiers, not peasants, and certainly not executioners. For decades, the executioner had lived a life unlike almost anyone around him. He had stood before crowds, carried out sentences, maintained order, endured isolation, watched generations grow up and disappear. But eventually, age began to catch him. The strong hands that once lifted heavy swords became slower. The sharp eyes that once noticed every detail no longer saw as clearly. The confidence built through years of experience remained, but the body itself gradually weakened. For most medieval workers, old age was difficult. For executioners, it could be especially complicated. Their profession depended heavily upon physical ability. A blacksmith might continue supervising apprentices. A merchant could manage a shop. A farmer could assign labor to younger family members. An executioner needed strength, coordination, and precision. Without those qualities, performing executions became increasingly dangerous. Many aging executioners began training their sons long before retirement became necessary. The transition often happened gradually. The father supervised. The son performed more responsibilities. Year after year, the balance shifted. Eventually, the apprentice became the master, and the old executioner stepped into the background. Yet retirement did not always bring peace. Many executioners discovered that the social isolation of their profession continued long after their working years ended. The townspeople who had avoided them for decades rarely changed their attitudes overnight. Old habits survived. Old prejudices survived. Old fears survived. A retired executioner often remained an outsider, even when he no longer carried out punishments, even when his sword remained hanging untouched on a wall, even when younger generations barely remembered the executions that once defined his life. Sometimes he would sit outside his home and watch the town from a distance. Children played in the streets. Merchants opened their shops. Church bells echoed through the morning air. Life continued exactly as it always had. The town no longer needed him as often. Yet he could never completely separate himself from the role he had occupied for so many years. An executioner might retire from the profession, but he could never fully retire from the reputation. And so the old man spent his final years carrying memories few others could understand. Memories of crowds, memories of judgments, memories of faces long forgotten by everyone else. The world moved forward, but the past remained close beside him, like a shadow that refused to disappear. As old age settled over him, the executioner found himself spending more time with his thoughts. The work that once dominated his life had slowed. The crowds had disappeared. The urgent demands of local authorities belonged to younger men now. Silence filled many of his days, and in that silence came memories. Some were pleasant. He remembered family celebrations, weddings, births, quiet evenings spent around a fire, moments when the outside world seemed far away, moments when he felt less like an executioner and more like an ordinary man. Other memories were more difficult. Faces returned. Not every face. There had been too many years for that. Too many executions. Too many punishments. Too many people passing through his life. Yet certain moments remained impossible to forget. Prisoner's final words. A frightened expression. A crowd's reaction. The sound of church bells on a cold morning. These memories appeared unexpectedly. Sometimes while eating. Sometimes while walking. Sometimes in the middle of the night when sleep refused to come. The executioner rarely spoke about them. Most people would not have understood. After all, who could truly understand such experiences? Very few professions placed individuals so close to the most dramatic moments of human life. For decades, the executioner had stood at the intersection of law, fear, justice, and death. Those experiences left marks that could not be seen. Invisible scars accumulated over the years. Yet despite everything, many executioners remained surprisingly practical. Life in the Middle Ages demanded resilience. People learned to continue moving forward despite hardship. The old executioner understood that regret could not change the past. The sentences had been issued. The punishments had been carried out. History could not be undone. What remained was acceptance. Acceptance of choices. Acceptance of responsibilities. Acceptance of a life few people would ever truly understand. As the years passed, the old man increasingly became a living piece of local history. Young people heard stories about him, some exaggerated, some entirely false, others surprisingly accurate. The executioner occasionally smiled at these tales. After all, he knew better than anyone how stories changed with time. The truth slowly faded. The legend slowly grew. And so, as another winter approached and the evenings became longer, the executioner sat quietly with the weight of an entire lifetime behind him. The end of his journey was drawing closer now. The crowds were gone. The work was finished. Only one final chapter remained. The chapter every human being must eventually face. His own ending. Every life, no matter how unusual, eventually reaches its final chapter. For the medieval executioner, that chapter often arrived quietly. There were no cheering crowds, no public ceremonies, no grand monuments celebrating decades of service. The man who had spent a lifetime standing at the center of some of the town's most memorable events usually faced his own ending in relative obscurity. As age weakened his body, daily routines became smaller. The walks grew shorter. The work disappeared. The responsibilities that once filled every week were now carried by younger hands. The executioner's sword, once maintained with meticulous care, might hang untouched for months at a time. Dust slowly gathered upon its surface. A tool that had once defined an entire life became little more than a memory. Many executioners spent their final years surrounded by family. Children had become adults. Grandchildren played in the same yards where previous generations had grown up. The world continued moving forward. New merchants opened shops. New officials governed the town. New stories replaced old ones. Meanwhile, the executioner watched time pass from the sidelines. Perhaps this was one of the strangest parts of growing old. The realization that events which once felt enormous had gradually faded from public memory. Executions that once attracted hundreds of spectators were now forgotten. Names that once dominated conversations had vanished completely. People who had feared him were gone. People who had hated him were gone. Even many of those who had known him personally had disappeared. Only memories remained. In these final years, some executioners reportedly became more reflective. Without the constant demands of work, they had time to think, time to remember, time to ask difficult questions. Had their lives mattered? Had they served justice? Had they been treated fairly? There were no simple answers. The executioner occupied a unique position in society. He was both necessary and rejected, respected and feared, visible and isolated. Few professions carried such contradictions. As illness eventually approached, as it did for nearly everyone in the medieval world, the executioner often faced the same uncertainty as any other person. Medieval medicine offered limited help. A minor infection could become fatal. A simple illness could worsen rapidly. The future remained unpredictable. Some executioners likely feared death. Others may have accepted it calmly. After all, they had spent decades standing closer to mortality than most people ever would. They understood better than anyone how fragile life could be. They had witnessed countless endings. Now their own was approaching. And perhaps, in those quiet final moments, they understood something the crowds never did. That behind every execution had been a human being. Not a symbol, not a monster, not a legend. Simply a man trying to fulfill the role history had given him. And now, his own story was nearing its conclusion. When a medieval executioner finally died, the world rarely stopped to notice. No church bells rang in his honor. No statues were erected. No songs celebrated his achievements. For most executioners, death arrived as quietly as old age itself. Yet the true story of an executioner did not end with his burial. It continued in memory, and memory is a curious thing. The townspeople remembered the profession, but often forgot the person. They remembered the scaffold, but forgot the man who climbed it. They remembered the sword, but forgot the hand that carried it. Over time, stories replaced reality. Children heard tales about mysterious executioners from generations past. Travelers shared exaggerated accounts. Legends grew larger. Facts became blurred. The real individual slowly disappeared beneath layers of myth. This happened to many executioners throughout history. Their humanity faded. Their reputation remained. Yet if we could travel back through the centuries and meet one of these men, the reality would likely surprise us. We would not find a monster. We would not find a creature untouched by emotion. Instead, we would find someone remarkably familiar. A father concerned about his children. A husband worried about providing for his family. A worker trying to perform his duties well. A person who experienced loneliness, pride, frustration, hope, and fear. In many ways, executioners reflected a truth about human history itself. Societies often depend upon people they do not fully accept. Difficult jobs still need to be done. Uncomfortable responsibilities still exist. And throughout history, someone has always been asked to carry those burdens. The executioner was one of those people. For centuries, he stood where others would not. He accepted a role few desired. He paid a social price few were willing to pay. And whether he chose that life or inherited it, he carried its consequences every day. As our journey comes to an end, the medieval town around us grows quiet. The market stalls have closed. The fires burn low inside wooden homes. The church bells have fallen silent. Night settles over the cobblestone streets. Somewhere beyond the edge of town stands the small house where an old executioner once lived. The crowds are gone now. The judgments are finished. The work is over. Only history remains. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. For when we look beyond the hood, beyond the sword, and beyond the stories, we discover something unexpected. The lonely life of a medieval executioner was not defined solely by death. It was defined by the very human desire to belong, to be understood, to be accepted, a desire that remains unchanged even after hundreds of years. And so, as the town drifts into darkness and the final embers fade into the night, we leave our executioner where history has left him, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a man whose story, like all stories, eventually came to an end. Good night.